anti-penultimate lecture before the summer. We've got just 2 more after this before we take a little break for August, and then depending on the state of the world we will decide whether or not we reconvene. And all 3 of them are going to be thinking about the impact of COVID-19 on our lives. So next week we're going to hear from our member Mark Borelowitz about what we've learned about human resilience during the course of the COVID crisis. And then I'm delighted in a couple of weeks' time, Peter Hyman is going to be following up from the article that he wrote in The Observer by giving a lecture on the future of education after COVID-19. But for this evening, I'm really thrilled that Professor Margaret Harris, is going to be speaking for a while on the future of civil society and charities in the COVID-19 era. And as with all of our previous lectures, if you have questions during Margaret's talk, please do feel free to send them to me at josh@alyth.org.uk, and then as many of them as I can, I will build into the conversation that Margaret and I will have after her presentation. For now, I'm delighted to hand over to Margaret.
Thank you very much. The topics for tonight, which I'm going to try and deal with, is what is civil society and why should we be interested in it at all? What's included in the civil society sphere? And then those 2 are by way of preliminary. And then I'm going to say something about how civil society has been responding to the COVID crisis. And then finally, I'll try and look ahead a bit about how we will live with the COVID crisis in civil society over the next few months, and finish with some of the longer term issues, which are obviously quite tentative at the moment. So, what is civil society? Civil society you can think of as a space in which people do things collectively for each other, not directly controlled by governments or business. So a more negative way of thinking about it is activities which are not part of national, regional or local government, not part of the commercial for-profit sector, and not part of the activities which we do with our families and as friendship groups. A lot of other words used to refer to roughly the same thing. The third sector, the voluntary sector, the NGO sector, the non-profit sector. In some countries, they refer to the social economy. And another way of referring to this area, which will become clear later on, is mediating structures. And you might notice, you don't need to look too closely, but there's a picture of the Alyth group in Israel, good example of a civil society group, not controlled in any way by anybody except ourselves. Right, now why should we be interested in civil society? Why have a lecture on it? There's a long-standing concern, which a lot of political philosophers have been writing about for a couple of 100 years, which is basically about the danger of powerful governments intruding into the freedom of people to collect together, to pursue activities for their common good or for mutual benefit. And that would include faith-based activities, which we're all very familiar with. Civil society can be an intermediary and a protector against authoritarian and totalitarian governments. It's very noteworthy that populist politicians that we've heard a lot about in the last couple of years, they move to curtail civil society as quickly as they can, and they prefer to interact directly with their populations. The picture, of course, is the back of Trump doing what he loves doing, which is speaking to people directly. In times of crisis, and this is in a way an additional point at the moment, In times of crisis, governments quite legitimately and fairly have to take emergency powers to control their populations, but they may be reluctant to relinquish those powers after the crisis has passed. We had the Coronavirus Act in March here, and our government has actually used a number of other powers to control how we behave during the crisis. Basically, the civil society concept is ultimately about something that we should care very deeply about, the preservation of freedom and democracy. So that's why we should be interested in it. And I had to put in, of course, a reference here to Hong Kong, where civil society, as we now know tragically this week, has not been successful in standing up to authoritarian government. But it's been trying and it's still trying. Okay, so which organizations and groups are part of civil society? What are we actually talking about here? Well, there's a number of different sorts of groups. It's actually, civil society is a vast swathe of activity, but I'm going to just mention some of them. First of all, we have the things that we're probably all very familiar with, service providing voluntary organizations. Often the registered charities in this country. And that can be the large national brands with paid staff through to small local organizations solely run by volunteers, and lots of combinations in between. Some have local branches, some have national headquarters. The picture at the bottom, there are two pictures there of interest. One is to emphasize about providing services to others. And the other is to mention Kids Company, which just a reminder that not everything in civil society is wonderful or behaves well or wisely. In fact, I have a colleague who's written a book called The Dark Side of Civil Society. But another lot of groups within civil society we're very familiar with, which would include reform synagogues in this country, are membership associations, so common interest groups, leisure groups, community associations, residents associations. And the main purpose that they have is to serve the needs of their members. They may or may not be registered charities in this country. The third type of organization within civil society is self-help and mutual aid groups. And they're about reciprocity. They're not just serving the needs of their members, they're actually about doing things for each other, helping each other. And I just put a couple of logos, Action for ME and Alcoholics Anonymous, both of which are about helping each other. Then we've got neighborhood and street level groupings, and they have to be mentioned in the context of the current crisis, and I'll come back to that. And then we have infrastructure organizations, which are often unseen and unremarked upon, but they're absolutely crucial for supporting groups within civil society. They give advice, they lobby government on behalf of civil society. And here's logos here of just a couple of infrastructure organizations that do exactly that. But we still go on. There's a lot more in civil society. We have advocacy and lobbying groups. Mostly in this country, they're not charities, or they're partially not charities, because they engage in advocacy, which is not a charitable activity. And we have philanthropic foundations, well-known gentlemen in that picture. We go on. We have what are called social movements, which are not individual organizations, they're collections of people with a common cause: civil rights, Black Lives Matter, climate change, tackling child poverty. This is a larger swathe of civil society activity. Now, I've been talking about groups and collections of people, but some civil society activity is more about behavior than about organisations or groups. So mass protests, mass demonstrations, public rallies, often linked with social movements, they're part of civil society. Informal neighbouring, not part of an organised group, just groups of neighbours looking out for each other. Then we have networks, loose linkages and collaborations that may be temporary to deal with particular needs. And then, of course, something that I expect most of you are very familiar with, volunteering. Within volunteering, we have what's now quite old-fashioned regular volunteering, where people commit to doing something on a weekly or monthly basis. We have ad hoc volunteering, which is becoming more and more common, where people volunteer to do things as and when they can and as and when there's a need. We have events volunteering, and you have a picture there taken during the Olympics of all those volunteers who helped make the Olympics happen in London. And really relevant to what we're talking about tonight, spontaneous volunteering. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but spontaneous volunteering is very common in crisis situations. There may be a lone person wants to help, or it could be an entrepreneurial group of initiatives, which I'll come back to. And finally, before we move on, this vast swathe of activity, which is encompassed by the idea of civil society. Of course, donating money and goods is a form of civil society activity. And raising money in order to get people to donate, as with the Red Nose Day stuff. We've got a picture of food banks, and the picture of in the corner of the bottom corner is of the mass of donated goods and food which arrived after the Grenfell Tower tragedy. Right, now turning now to civil society in the current crisis. We've talked about what is civil society, we've looked at what's included within civil society, and now I'm going to talk a bit about what we know about how civil society has been responding to the current crisis. I think it's sensible to look at the period of the crisis in two phases if we're looking at what's been happening in civil society. The period from the end of February to roughly the middle of April, when the infection was starting to peak and civil society was what I would call hyperactive. As a background, we should note that at that point, during that period, the focus of response to the crisis from politicians and from civil society was largely to do with health and social care, really basic response to human needs. And then the second period, from April to now, where there has been a growing sense of getting the monster under control and looking forward to what the government likes to call recovery. I'd be a bit cautious about calling it that, but here the focus of the response has moved from immediate concerns about health and social care towards matters of education, employment, and of course economic recovery, which we've heard a lot about, and especially yesterday in the Chancellor's summer statement. So going back to February to April, which seems a long time ago, which was civil society in its hyperactive phase. And I've picked out just four areas that I'm going to talk about because they seem to me to be most remarkable and most worthy of being recorded at this phase. And I'm going to take these 4 points one by one, so I won't read them. Right. I need to, the first point that I want to talk about is responding to the needs of the most vulnerable and the socially isolated. And this has been really quite remarkable, and we should never underestimate what happened in this country, in the civil society, in February, March and April. I just need to say, for those of you who are not totally clear about this, that it's important to note that there are two identified groups that were identified very early on in the crisis. One is the group, the shielded group. We probably got some members of that group here tonight. Originally, it was estimated to be 1.5 million people. More recently, it's said to have been 2.2 million people. These were a group of people, this is really interesting, they were identified and recognized by the government very early on in the crisis, and their needs were responded to by multi-agency hubs, which included local authorities. And I noticed that Barnet, for example, is very proud of the way that it responded to the shielded group, but actually it doesn't mention that it was only able to do that by close cooperation with local voluntary organisations, that is, with civil society. Now, the point about that shielded group, apart from the fact that it's intriguing to note how they were identified, is that they were told not to leave their homes. So that immediately there was an issue about really the basic need to survive. Where were they going to get their food from? Which was the major point, and government responded to that, picked that up right from the start. Now, there's another group, though, that we need to talk about in relation to civil society, which is a much, much bigger group, and which, apart from being identified by government, has not received attention from government. So this is at least a further 10 million people. It's hard to know exactly how many, but this includes everybody over the age of 70, plus large numbers of people who have various health conditions which did not place them in the shielded group. There were no government plans for the people who were told to maintain social isolation because they were vulnerable, that group. They also had needs for grocery shopping. They also had need for prescription collection. They also had needs for social contact. And that group was recognized and responded to from the outset by civil society. This group were largely dependent on individual and neighborhood initiatives if they didn't have non-vulnerable family or friends. It was no good just having family and friends who could do this, because if they were also in the vulnerable group, that was no use to you. And this situation is still ongoing. It's not recognized very often, but what civil society did during this early period is incredibly important, incredibly impressive. So the other form of responding was, as you would expect, through established charities and voluntary organisations with a track record of responding to social and health need. What was interesting from the point of view of the current situation is that, and this is most unusual, there were a lot of people who wanted to help, but this coincided with their availability because we had this rush of people who were furloughed or made unemployed or who were not in education due to the crisis. So we had a coincidence of people who wanted to help with people actually having the time to help. Many people who wanted to help in the early days of the crisis approached established care organisations like the Red Cross. In the case of the Jewish community, a lot of people approached Jewish Care, Charities for the Catholic community, and what are the local community hubs which have been set up over the last few years in local authority areas. We have one in Barnet. Now, the point about established charities are that they are obliged to carry out safeguarding and other checks. They can't just say to people who want to help, yes, sure, go and visit Mrs. Cohen. They can't do that. They've got to check people from safeguarding point of view. They have to match the skills people are offering with available opportunities. So they're quite inflexible. At the same time, most of the established charities don't have spare capacity for volunteer management or recruitment or training. So what happened in March was that there were a lot of people coming forward to these charities wanting to help, but the charities weren't able to handle the influx of willing volunteers. And many early volunteer offers were never taken up. Many volunteers waited several weeks before they were offered to get involved. Meanwhile, spontaneous volunteering. Well, we're very familiar in this country with spontaneous volunteering in times of flood. Luckily, we're not living in areas which are liable to extensive flooding, but in those parts of the country where that is the case, they're very used to the fact that when flood occurs and people hear about it, they turn up at the scene just wanting to help. Often they'll turn up with a boat if they have one. They may turn up with their 4x4 to help rescue people. They'll turn up with ladders, they'll turn up with ropes. They just want to help. And that's not an unalloyed benefit, but we'll come back to that. With COVID-19, the spontaneous volunteering happened very early and very quickly at street and neighborhood level in a most remarkable way. Not just people looking out for each other in their local areas. We had people making scrubs for the NHS staff in their own homes, sourcing the material. We had young people making visors on their 3D printers in their bedrooms. And then we had people making meals for NHS staff, people spontaneously sharing food with neighbours just to cheer them up. Over time, many of those small spontaneous initiatives evolved into loosely organised non-profit enterprises or networks, and you've probably heard of the COVID-19 mutual aid initiatives. There was one in Barnet, which these are interesting because they're not registered charities and they're very informal. So they didn't have to do the sorts of checks that registered charities have to do. What was interesting during those early days of the crisis was that we suddenly saw, and this could be worrying if you're of the worrying kind, we saw bypassing of all the usual regulations on food preparation. We saw bypassing of safeguarding regulations. We saw bypassing of data privacy, not least by government. We saw bypassing of volunteer screening and training. And all that is very characteristic of spontaneous volunteering in times of crisis. If you know anything about, for example, Hurricane Katrina and how that was responded to, everything just goes out the windows in time of extreme crisis. I want to mention one other hyperactivity phase, activity in civil society, because it hasn't been much remarked on, and yet it's probably caused a lot of people a lot of heartache, especially if you are or have been a charity trustee. Often charity trustees are fairly passive and can be fairly passive. But what we had was a huge rise in demand on social and healthcare charities for services. So at the start of the crisis, but that was accompanied with increased costs associated with adapting the service to the pandemic, either supplying PPE or putting, as Alyth had to do, putting everything online, or adapting your service provision online, or maybe to people who aren't online but need the service. So, okay, but this placed all but the very largest charities in a very difficult position, which led to the charity trustees becoming much more involved in the operational activities of the charities, whereas normally they may be quite absent from day-to-day activity. The point is that the main sources of annual and future income from fundraising events and from charity shops immediately came under threat as soon as the crisis bit, in addition to the fact that most people anticipated that there'd be an economic crisis in due course. So charity trustees had an awareness of a major financial threat to their income, and they often will have no rainy day money because charities, ironically, are discouraged by regulators and funders from accumulating reserves. It's seen as not good practice not to spend your money on your intended beneficiaries and to squirrel it away. That might get rethought in the future. There was also a high incentive on charities to put their staff on furlough, along with businesses as well and public sector organisation. Now, there was an incentive on charities to preserve their staff jobs at all cost, and yet staff on furlough can't deliver services. So there's an incredible dilemma faced by charities delivering services relevant to the crisis. They have legal and ethical obligations which pulled in opposite directions. Should they fulfill their charitable objectives as trustees, or should they conserve the resources to sustain their charity for as long as possible? And this is an ongoing problem and has meant that, and as Alyth trustees know this only too well, has meant that some charity trustees that were accustomed to meeting 2 or 3 times a year have had to meet almost weekly. Moving on to the consolidation phase, if you might say, of civil society from the beginning, mid-April until now. In that period, we had central government apparently having more clearly formulated policies about the response. By that time, local authorities has mostly cracked the logistics of helping the shielded group. You may know about or have received a food box to keep you going during the crisis when you were supposed not to be going out. Incidentally, most of those food boxes were actually delivered by charities, by civil society, although the distribution was administered from local authorities. It continued to be the case from April onwards until now that the other vulnerable group of people were mostly being responded to, if at all, by informal civil society efforts, not by government. And I'm now going to just mention one by one 5 points about this phase, which I think are worth noting in relation to civil society. First, the rise in digital volunteering, which is, it actually picked up on a trend, that was already underway, but accelerated it. So there was a development of volunteer opportunities and training for those unable to leave home, and also a revival of basic telephone use for social contact. That was one thing that has been happening in the later phase. Another is this intriguing formation of networks. Covid-19 mutual aid network, which I've mentioned, formed. There are now 700 of these groups which are formed into a national network. There was links, informal links of collaboration formed between frontline responders. For example, groups that were making food or making meals got in touch with their local food banks so that no food was wasted and it was passed between organizations. And there also have been collaborations between volunteer involving charities in order to maximize the recruitment and involvement of available volunteers. So where people were volunteering for one organization, often their details would pass with their permission to other organisations where there was known to be a need for volunteers. So the normal competition for volunteering just melted away. And in the case of the Jewish community, this was all coordinated by the Jewish Volunteering Network, which was able to do that. Now, the third really remarkable thing is the formalization and growth of grassroots initiatives. And I'm going to illustrate that with one case example, which was on our doorstep here in Hampstead Garden suburb. This is the top picture is of a mini marquee, which was erected in the front garden of a house in Hampstead Garden suburb, in a road that is normally noted for being very immaculate. It was what this group did was, it was called You Donate, We Deliver. One woman living in the house behind the mini marquee thought she really wanted to help and do something. She heard that people were delivering cakes and biscuits and sweets to NHS hospital staff. She wanted to be part of that. She drew in friends and family. And all of a sudden, the demand during the end of March, beginning of April, spiraled from NHS staff who said, actually, we can't leave the wards. We need food, we need meals. We don't need cakes and biscuits and sweets, we need meals. And this was one of many groups that sprung into action. It was the most remarkable piece of organization. The founding woman had never volunteered for anything in her life before. What she did was she got people to donate money and food, vegetarian food. She then got other people to come and collect the food, gave them instructions how to cook it and box it. They then brought the food back to her mini marquee in the front of her house, from where another group of people delivered the food on a daily basis to hospitals all around London. And by the end of the crisis period, they were delivering 600 ready-to-heat meals a day for NHS staff on COVID wards. And this is just one of many, many hundreds such initiatives. No registration with anybody, no regulation about the food, no regulation about the labeling of the food, no regulation about anything. They just got on with it and did it. It's been wound up, by the way, now. Other support during this second phase of the crisis from civil society, we have the supporting the NHS from the grassroots. Of course, we all know about the Thursday clapping and the rainbows, and about the donations delivered to hospitals for comforting things for staff, moisturisers, biscuits, bottles of water. People donated their spaces in their drives so that NHS staff could park near hospitals. I mentioned the people who made PPE and donated it. And then, well, of course, we all know about Major Tom. So there was this big fundraising effort, not for the NHS itself, but for the NHS charities, which in theory provide extras that the NHS itself can't provide. So 130 million pounds had been raised by last week for the NHS charities together. And that was for food for staff, iPads for staff and patients, and also for mental health facilities. And what is interesting about all that is that if you think the NHS is a government organisation fundamentally, what we have here is civil society apparently supporting another sector, the governmental sector. And then I can't leave this recitation without mentioning the NHS Emergency Responders Scheme, which has had the most enormous amount of publicity. 750,000 people are reported to have been recruited to help the NHS by the 10th of April. But the actual recruitment was done by the Royal Voluntary Service, which is a large trusted charity. And it's noteworthy that governments like to work with the big charities that are similar in their organisational structure to government departments. This was marketed as helping NHS patients with shopping, medicine, driving, and regular phone contacts. And the volunteers for this in this emergency responders scheme were contacted via a phone app. It's not actually clear at this stage how many of the people, the 750,000 people, actually did anything at all. In other words, were actually given tasks to do. The figure I heard today was 100,000. And of course, that then raises issues with 100,000 people are thought to have actually been given tasks to do. And of those, many of them did very little, perhaps 2 or 3 tasks, so collecting prescriptions or something like that. And the question is about the impact on future motivation to volunteer of people who signed up with great enthusiasm and their services were never used. It sort of like feels as though government swallowed up a lot of the goodwill. Okay, so what can we say about the pattern of the civil society crisis? There's a lot of familiar things going on, that the government in crisis chooses who it's going to help. The government provides a safety net. It tries to ensure that people don't starve to death. Governments prefer to deal with the large formal charities, and they try to capture the spirit of civil society. And I'll come back to that in a minute about the future. The government support for charities, I explained earlier, the terrible dilemmas that they've been facing, but the amount of financial support for charities from government has so far been very, very minimal. But interesting how local government relied on civil society in order to identify people. They needed the local knowledge that civil society has. And also familiar, it's spontaneous volunteering in times of crisis, the sense of solidarity in times of crisis, and the fact that managing volunteers is a scarce resource. I'm just going to move on because I realise that we're getting short of time. This is more important than what was on the previous slide. This is a wonderful example. This is my favourite photograph of the COVID crisis. Civil society steps in to replace government service. As soon as the crisis bit, the city corporation, which runs Hampstead Heath, removed all the litter bins and the dog waste bins, certainly from the Heath extension, I suspect all over the Heath. Within days, there were dog waste bags all over the Heath, discarded all over the Heath. Some of them found their way into the branches of trees because of the wind, and the place was a mess. Within another few days, some civil society person, I don't know who it was, set up their own dog waste system on the Heath extension, with a lot of instructions about how to dispose of your dog waste. Beautiful example of civil society stepping in when government has stepped back during the crisis. Okay, so now the last few minutes, let's just look ahead. What's going to happen in the future? Well, here's a selection of headlines in the last 2 weeks, just taken at random, that give you a very good flavour of what we're looking at. Compassion fatigue, people just get fed up with being nice to each other. Charity shops closing, with a devastating impact on the income of many charities. The Salvation Army, it says it's spending 20,000 a week on PPE. The Charity Commission has helpfully issued insolvency advice for charities, and the Institute of Fundraising estimates that charities are likely to lose £12.4 billion in income over the year. Well, what should we be looking out for in the next few months? My crystal ball is not any better than any of yours, but here's some of the guesses. Charities will struggle to survive financially. We're going to see mergers, we're going to see collaborations, we're going to see big name charities in trouble, major cutbacks in services, restructuring, and I suspect a search for volunteers to replace those who started to go back to work and are no longer available. This in turn will mean a loss of civil society services responding to very pressing social needs, including those revealed or exacerbated by the crisis. We've heard about domestic violence, about food insecurity, about what is known as digital deprivation. Many children were unable to do their schoolwork because they haven't got computers. Advice needs, mental health needs, remedial education needs, homelessness. Now, all of these have been exacerbated by the crisis, and yet the organizations that most usually provide the bulk of services for those groups of people are the charities who themselves are struggling financially. More optimistically, we'll see innovative funding campaigns, virtual dinners, community chests. We're going to see pressure on government to help charities, not least from the charity infrastructure organizations themselves. But we're also going to see, and watch out for this, pressure from government on charities to help with the recovery. An MP called Danny Kruger, a backbench Conservative MP, has been charged with consulting in order to maximise the role of volunteers in the recovery, which to anybody who cares about the freedom of civil society rings alarm bells. We're going to see a changing landscape of volunteering and overall a shortage of volunteers. And to be a bit pessimistic, civil society can also be, as we saw, a society of mass demonstrations, and I suspect that there'll be a certain amount of unrest from groups that have suffered particularly. We've already seen BAME groups being most concerned about what's happening with low-paid workers, the NHS, and unemployment. These are all areas where we're likely to see maybe polite demonstrations, may be a bit more unhappy than that. So the longer term impacts of COVID-19. Well, there's good news and bad news. The very serious long-term news, which is bad, is that the medical research charities in particular have warned that they will not be able to invest over the next few years in the amount of research which we're used to. The British Heart Foundation has been amongst the charities that have put up a warning about that. I think we can expect a very patchy response to social problems as charities are unable to respond to the problems that are emerging. We will see a change in charity landscape. The charities that we know and love may disappear or be absorbed into other charities or be taken over. And if we follow previous patterns, there's likely to be a clamping down by government on assertive actions from civil society. We've actually seen in the quite recent past attempts by governments to restrict the amount of lobbying that civil society does prior to election periods. And I suspect that we'll see something of that as we come up to the next elections. On the sunny side, renewed neighbourliness, a new sense of knowing who your neighbour is, that you need to look out for them. Going digital, as the phrase is, which was probably long overdue, an acceleration of something that we should have been doing anyway. Perhaps more volunteering for those who got a taste of it, and some reordering of public priorities for funding. And that is it. Thank you for listening.
Margaret, thank you so much. That's really wonderful and incredibly comprehensive. I think every time I thought of a question, you then answered it almost immediately. So it's interesting to me, kind of thinking about the what we might see in the future, without wishing to kind of indulge in futurology too much. I mean, one of the interesting things about this country is the interesting balance between civil society and the government sector. That we do have, nationalised healthcare, nationalised education. That actually the charitable sector has not been massively in those areas. But it feels like this has been an occasion on which that's been tested, actually, in a very interesting way. That actually we've seen, the civil society having to step into an area which was previously primarily government. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And does it? I mean, there's a bit of me that's very worried about it, because of course what it says is actually, there's the potential for us to continue for government to sort of pull out of that field to some extent, and hope that the voluntary sector will fill the gap.
Well, this touches on something that has been not sufficiently analysed and remarked on, which is that there has been a trend for a blurring of the boundaries between the three main sectors, in fact, between the government sector, the civil society sector, and the business sector. And some academics who I would otherwise have great respect for have written about hybridity, as though it's, that's okay, it doesn't matter. Well, it does matter for the reasons that I stated at the beginning, which is that governments intruding into civil society is historically very, very worrying. However, what we've seen in the best examples over the crisis has been collaboration rather than intrusion, by and large. So collaboration which doesn't intrude into the boundaries of either sector. Civil society hasn't tried to tell the NHS what to do, and by and large, the NHS hasn't told civil society what to do. But of course, depending on your ideology, you might have some concerns about the extent to which civil society had to provide what are regarded as peripheries to the NHS, but could perhaps be regarded as essentials, like PPE or providing food for staff when they're on 12-hour shifts and they can't leave to go to the hospital canteen. So it's theoretically problematic, and whether you think it's problematic, I think it's only problematic if we as a population of civil society don't watch out for what our governments are doing. So we need to be civically literate, I think, to watch for incursions.
But I suppose at a time in which the possibility is that certainly the voluntary sector will be suffering from, too much to do and too little capacity to actually do it, we rely on government to fill those gaps. So are those areas just going to be vacated? And what happens when? I mean, I suppose we're going to find out. But what happens when those natural roles, those natural spaces become blurred, and where there's areas that kind of are vacated as we move into the kind of post-COVID age?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not optimistic because the reason that I spent a few minutes talking about the difference between the shielded group and the vulnerable group that was told to self-isolate is that it's very noticeable that government concerned itself only with basic survival of something around 2 million people. The other 10, 12 million people who were not quite as badly off, but were also struggling for basic survival, were completely ignored by government. So we don't have a sort of a governmental system now which it concerns itself with the welfare of the whole population. And I just mentioned that in that second group of people, the vulnerable group, there actually are a large number of people with medical conditions. If you're diabetic, you were not put into the shielded group, for example. So it is worrying, and the signals are not good. And you might say, well, it's very unfortunate that the social needs that have been revealed by COVID are ones which government basically has left to the charity sector for many years now, in any case.
And collaboration, of course, also needs money, right? So, I mean, one of the things I was struck by in those first couple of weeks was um, I spent a number of times spent time on the phone, as did Lynette, with local government, just trying to work out how we would look after some of our members who were in that second category, and struggling with a local government that was just not not able to respond as quickly as one would have liked. And I think we kind of, those Barnet can celebrate its hubs as much as it wants now, but in those first couple of weeks, it quite clearly did not know what it was doing, and
Yes.
wasn't able to work with the voluntary sector in the way that one would have hoped. And and of course, it was a crisis that no one had experienced before. And at the same time, one would have hoped that local government would have those networks in place to some extent.
Yes. Well, in those early weeks, I was involved with a lot of discussions with the Cabinet Office. And what was clear and has not been made public is that basically central government dumped on local government. The local government has been emasculated really over the last few years. It's got very little left to do and it gets very little money. And when the crisis bit, central government said, we will look after these people who need shielding, and just turn them over to local government, which did not have the systems in place. They have social services departments. They didn't have the systems in place, and they were really floundering. And also, they don't have volunteer management resources, for example. And they had to somehow find a way of getting food deliveries organized. And there were apocryphal stories, which I've actually seen this mentioned many times. Local authorities had a lot of staff who didn't have much to do as soon as the crisis bit, including librarians. And it was often the librarians who were seconded to organize the distribution of food boxes at local authority level. Well, that's so I have a certain sympathy for local government, because just like Jewish Care or the other big charities, they can't bypass all the regulations. They can't bypass the safeguarding regulations, the food regulations, and so on. So they really were dumped on um, um, during the early days of the crisis, and they relied on civil society knowledge at the local level and civil society willingness to help.
And of course, it's not just those large charities that have to worry about regulations and safeguarding. It's also true of generally of kind of synagogues as well. We had lots of conversations about how would we actually get the food that we had to our vulnerable members when people who are volunteering did not have any checks done, for example. And what was very interesting for us is that when we were phoning we were phoning local government and saying we've got food, we don't have ability to get it to people, and they were saying, well, just take it to them then. And kind of that sort of breakdown in those kind of core ideas of kind of, good governance, but also, safeguarding is core to what we do. So I suppose one of the interesting questions for me is that have we is one of the things we've discovered that we've actually created structures around charities which makes it which are too rigid. It's too difficult for us to do the work that we need to do.
Well, but we're talking about a really major crisis. The word always used, unprecedented. What was interesting is, thank goodness, the Charity Commission did issue a number of statements in the early weeks, not telling people to ignore the regulations, but just saying, we won't come down on you hard if you don't manage to organise your AGM this year. We won't come down on you hard if you don't submit your accounts this year. So they were sending out very strong signals that the regulations would be temporarily relaxed. But yes, this is the whole argument about regulation, isn't it? That you can, for the best of reasons, you can hobble people in certain circumstances. And I was involved in discussions here locally about looking out for your neighbour, where we had really well-intentioned people who were sticking notes through people's doors and saying, I'm your neighbour, if you need anything, let me get in touch with you. Well, 99% of those people were totally bona fide, but what about the 1% for whom the regulations on safeguarding apply, who were handling other people's money when they went shopping and who could easily get access to people's homes? So it's another one of those dilemmas of social policy, I suppose, about how you have regulation that doesn't go too far.
I mean, I'd say I am one of those people who is rather terrified by, or certainly kind of concerned about what seemed to happen in that moment. It was incredibly necessary and very concerning at the same time because of the bypassing of all of those regulations and those, good practice. But my sense is it happened largely because of the underinvestment in local government, because of the lack of a government structure which allowed charities and civil society to feed in a way which was structured in some way.
Yes, but civil society is always there underneath, and that's another way of looking at it. It allowed civil society to do its best, to do what it does best, to care for other people. Of course, in the long term, we have to remember why we ever had a welfare state, because civil society is not good at caring for people in the long term. And that's why that phrase compassion fatigue that I put up in the penultimate slide is very important. People are already getting fed up with looking after vulnerable people, looking out for their neighbours. They've had enough of it and they're getting tired. So we do need a back structure by government.
Though interesting, I think one of the areas where that fatigue has been less is within the faith sector.
Yeah.
So I mean, what's interesting for me is we still have hundreds of people phoning as buddies, not experiencing that fatigue, and actually within the faith sector, it seems to have created connections which perhaps were not there before. Yeah. Can you say a little bit about how the faith sector's responded and how it fits into that broader picture?
Well, I hesitate to say it because it sounds divisive, but it has varied between religions and between denominations. One of the things, I'm sure you, Josh, know about this, but the Church of England actually hasn't covered itself in glory. It closed the churches immediately, which to Jewish people may not seem so serious, but for people who were isolated and on their own, who needed access to a quiet pray, it was a terrible thing to do. Round here, interestingly, it's also to do with demographics, because in this area, in the Alyth area, there's a major problem, which is that although the Jewish community is fairly balanced demographically, the Christian community isn't, and it's heavily elderly. And the faith leaders were in great difficulties because they didn't have the availability of volunteers because their congregants are largely themselves either shielding or in social isolation. So there's been a patchy. I actually took a photograph of which I was going to put on the slides but didn't. There was a very large notice pinned on the door of St. Jude's Church, which is a local Anglican church, saying this church is closed until further notice, which is, I mean, a devastating thing to say to anybody if it's your bit of the faith. But again, maybe, the fear of doing things wrong and spreading the virus, it's understandable.
Um, and the very challenging decisions that leaders and trustees are having to make in the context of, a very different understanding of what risk means, and kind of, trustees live with risk as kind of a concept, and now it's a very real thing that they have to take
Physical
counter.
risk, yeah.
Right, absolutely. If everyone will forgive me one more question, even though we're past our 8 o'clock. I'm interested in what happens next for volunteers and volunteering in this country. Have we got evidence from other places about what happens when you have kind of volunteer surges in response to crisis, and how we encourage people to continue to be volunteers, especially those who you rightly identify as having actually volunteered and then had remarkably little to do, which happened in lots of situations, including our own community, where we couldn't use the number of volunteers that we had?
Well, first of all, it is demotivating. We know that if somebody volunteers and you don't involve them immediately, and they become demotivated. And often, if you don't involve them in doing exactly what they want to do, which is even more difficult, often they want to do the glamorous stuff, and or what they regard as publicity worthy. So I think that I'm not an optimist. I know that the Jewish Volunteering Network, which I'm closely involved with, is very optimistic and is putting a lot of effort at the moment into how do we retain the people who came forward. What we know about spontaneous volunteering, that isn't going to work. Spontaneous volunteers come for their own reasons, and somebody who volunteered, let us say, to make PPE for the local hospital, is not going to want to be told to do something else. By and large, we like to pretend that the concept of volunteering is one that we all understand, but actually, it's what people are doing is they're volunteering for X. So, I want to volunteer for the shul, I want to volunteer for Jewish care. What I don't want to do is just be a volunteer and somebody else tells me what to do. So, and we know that spontaneous volunteers in particular are enormously difficult to manage. It's a headache. I've been involved in studies of spontaneous volunteers in flood situations. And they are a nightmare because they don't understand the dangers of floods. They've got no training in how you conduct yourself in floods, and notoriously will get into flood waters that are poisoned or walk into holes where there ought to be a manhole cover and there no longer is one. So that's very symbolic of the lack of training and guidance of spontaneous volunteers. I'm not optimistic that we're going to turn people around. I suspect the levels of volunteering will just go back to as they were before, unless we have large numbers of people who are not able to re-enter society fully, older people who might well be induced to volunteer from home virtually.
Margaret, our time is done. I'm incredibly grateful to you. We are all incredibly grateful to you for a really fascinating hour. I look forward to reading the article that that turns into, I assume. And really, thank you so much for offering us an hour of your expertise and wisdom this evening.
Thank you for having me.
So we continue with these for the next 2 weeks, running up to Tisha B'Av, and then we're going to take a little break. So next week, our member Mark Borelowitz, who is the director of child and adolescent mental health at the Royal Free Hospital, and who was also very involved in supporting the work of the hospital staff during the COVID crisis, during that first wave, is going to be speaking about human resilience. So he's done work looking at the teens who were trapped in the cave in Thailand, and also the work around supporting people through the COVID crisis. And he's going to talk about what we know about human resilience. So that's next week at 7 o'clock back here. And Margaret, thank you once again.
Thank you.